You are listening to the Foreign Policy Focus podcast.
We cannot wait for the final proof. The smoking gun could come in the form of a mushroom cloud.
Haven't you driven enough people from their homes already? Bulldoze their villages, seize their property and their laws. They had no part in making it.
Now working in Libya with friends and allies, we've demonstrated what collective action can achieve in the 21st century.
Now the host of the show, Kyle Ansel.
This is episode 412 of the Foreign Policy Focus podcast. On today's show, I'm talking about the death of ISIS leader al-Baghdadi. I'm going to get into, what this means in the U.S. war on terror, the fight against ISIS. Is the Islamic State now defeated? And of course, some analysis on Trump's speech in which he announced that Baghdadi had been killed by U.S. forces. So I think this will be a good one and one that may generate a lot of interest. So really think about just taking a couple minutes real quick and sharing the show. Go libertarianinstitute.org, Facebook, Twitter, or just recommend it to somebody. You'll find that and the daily news roundup that I write there at the Libertarian Institute. If you're a new listener to the show, make sure you subscribe to it somewhere. Give it a rating and review if possible. And of course, the Patreon page is patreon.com/foreignpolicyfocus. The leader of the Islamic State, Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, is reported to be killed. It seems like there's pretty much consensus that the guy died. Donald Trump, in his speech on the matter, said a DNA test or some kind of test was done at the scene to confirm that this was Baghdadi. The only indication I'm seeing that it could, possibly not be him is Russia seems somewhat reluctant to confirm that Baghdadi is killed, but it seems just about the rest of the international community is celebrating his death. Now, this has been misreported at times in the past. But this certainly seems to be the most that everybody has kind of bought into it, and there's been a real consensus that this guy is definitely dead. It's now reported that they gave him, similar to what they say about, at least the official narrative, Osama bin Laden, a sea burial, so that they kicked him off the ship somewhere and threw him into the water. Of course, the people who claim that Baghdadi for some reason wasn't killed will certainly kind of point to this as a reason for conspiracy. I don't see why, it either wouldn't be true or that, they possibly cut up and destroyed his body some other way, maybe some more brutal way. But, the kind of public nice narrative that they're putting out is that, they just threw it into the sea. The mission took place Saturday night, and a lot of the details that I'm going to give are mostly coming just from Donald Trump and the speech himself. So, there's always the possibility that Donald Trump is Donald Trump and he's misleading at times, exaggerating at times, outright lying at times. But I did, kind of try to capture what seemed to all make sense in a linear kind of way, versus what was maybe contradictory. So I try to leave that stuff out. And just, kind of get to what it seems like, at least the narrative that the U.S. and Donald Trump is putting forward, that while the mission, the raid actually happened on Saturday night, that this has been processed for a couple weeks. The U.S. has been pretty sure, I guess, they knew where al-Baghdadi was. So then, according to Donald Trump, and this is actually disputed by the Russians, Trump got clearance from them to fly some U.S. special forces into the Idlib province from Syria. I would assume that even if the U.S. didn't outright say that, hey, Russia, we're going after al-Baghdadi here, they must have had some kind of way to indicate that, this was a high-level jihadist target that they were going to take out. For Russia, I guess, to just be okay with the whole bunch of U.S. special forces flying in. Trump's reporting is that these helicopters, I believe there are 12 in total, took some fire from local forces on the ground. But at least, as Trump says, these weren't state actors, so it wasn't the Syrian army, it wasn't the Russians, I'm guessing it wasn't any Kurdish forces or Turkish forces, and so either rebel groups, or, maybe there's, at this point, just some towns or, different little villages, places, where the kind of local people who are from there just have their guns and, shoot at anyone flying overhead or anything like that. Trump says it takes about an hour to fly in. And this is really an area of kind of northwestern Syria along the border there. There was, kind of reporting and tweets going on that night, saying that there was kind of helicopter activity in the area. And after those troops had returned to base, Donald Trump had actually tweeted out that there was big news. So there was a lot of speculation that somebody was killed. All right, so I want to get into a little bit of who al-Baghdadi was, and I'll try to do this briefly and recommend early episodes of the show 2 years ago, episode 115 and episode 122, both with Will Porter. Part 1 is the rise of the Islamic State, Baghdadi coming to power, taking Raqqa, Mosul, Tikrit, Ramadi. And then part 2 is really the fall of the Islamic State. And while that was 2 years ago, me and Will had pointed out that, hey, now that the United States has gotten involved and that all these state actors like Russia, has taken the side of Assad, ISIS is clearly going to be defeated. At the time, I think the invasion of Mosul still may have been going on. Raqqa is surrounded at this point. And, we're able to say, like, hey, the Islamic State as an actual state actor is done. So for, kind of more details on the brief history I'm going to do here, check out those 2 shows. But at one point, al-Baghdadi is actually in Camp Bucca, which is one of these torture prisons in, the early part of the Iraq War, 2003, 2004. I think they kind of just label him as a thug and eventually let him out. Now, of course, I'm sure whatever, he was either witness or subject to there, and, probably the contacts he made in that prison as, one of the results of places like that in Abu Ghraib that we know is it radicalized a lot of people and it helped people make a lot of connections. So, this isn't even something that we don't see in the United States, right? With people end up joining gangs in prison and stuff like that and, becoming more violent. So this is, the results of those 2 camps, and one of those is al-Baghdadi. And I'm not sure people know a whole lot about what this guy was doing between his release, and I'm guessing that was 2004, 2005, and then, him rising to prominence, and I believe becoming the leader of the Islamic State in Iraq, ISI, and that was essentially just Al-Qaeda in Iraq. Well, 2011, the Arab Spring breaks out in Syria, and the Al-Qaeda, at that time, the Islamic State of Iraq, basically sets up a branch in Syria, but very distinctly doesn't call themselves Al-Qaeda or, the Islamic State, because they're a major part of the rebellion to Assad, and, those rebellions to Assad, either by giving them to actual people who weren't jihadists, or just giving them directly to the jihadists, were receiving a lot of support and weapons from, the United States covert program, Timber Sycamore, of course, John Brennan's thing that, in 2012, Michael Flynn, his DIA, said, hey, this could lead to Islamic Caliphate. Saudi Arabia, Qatar, the UAE, Turkey, all kind of supporting and funding this, armed opposition to Bashar al-Assad. So whether it's by al-Nusra and the other jihadists just taking the rebel weapons from the more moderate rebels just selling them to the more extremist rebels, or the CIA and other assets misidentifying or intentionally giving the weapons to the jihadist groups, the jihadists end up very well armed and able to take a lot of territory. This eventually leads to a split between Baghdadi and then the leader of al-Nusra or Al-Qaeda in Syria, al-Jolani, over kind of this strategic ideology kind of thing, where Osama bin Laden and Al-Qaeda had this idea that you had to defeat the far enemy, the United States, and just bleed us to bankrupt entirely before they're then able to try to establish an Islamic Caliphate, because, hey, if we do that, the United States will just come over here and destroy it, versus, Baghdadi, who I guess saw an opportunity, and certainly if you were reading Patrick Coburn at the time or listening to the Scott Horton show, you would know that they were saying, hey, there's a real opportunity here for a jihadist movement to come sweep in, not only into eastern Syria, but western Iraq, and this is really dangerous. And Baghdadi saw this and decided that he was going to, take a caliphate. And so, he took Raqqa and called it his capital city, and then took Mosul. And that time, I believe this is like 2014, he actually gives like kind of a sermon up at the Grand Mosque of that city and declares himself the Caliph, and, that the Islamic State is like some religious great thing that, divine by God has been bestowed upon him. And, the split between Baghdadi and Jolani actually ends up with conflicts between those two groups. These people are absolutely crazy, even though, their ideology is a lot closer to each other than pretty much anybody else who absolutely, most everybody else in the region hates the jihadists. So, you would think that the Islamic State and Al-Qaeda, despite their differences, would, not fight each other first. But, again, these are lunatics who cut people's heads off and stuff like that. ISIS also brands itself as being like kind of the most disgustingly dangerous and inspiring lone wolf kind of attacks. And, that's al-Baghdadi and, kind of where he came from. And then, how the Islamic State ends up being formed. And so whenever the raid happens, there's one very interesting point that, pretty much I think every foreign policy, kind of observer and expert points out is that, hey, it seems kind of weird that, this Idlib province of Syria is actually the one held by Jolani and the Al-Qaeda guys, and this is actually where Baghdadi is found. And so Donald Trump even messages this in his speech and kind of says that, hey, a lot of people are asking these questions, doesn't give a solid answer for what Baghdadi was doing there. Maybe with the Islamic State, his caliphate gone, he comes crawling back to Idlib on his knees and, kind of begs Jolani, like, hey, I guess we either have to do this your way or, thinks he can maybe get a little bit of money or something to fund his revolution. Not sure what he was doing up there. But I'm guessing, as we get into the talk about what's to come for the Islamic State, what he was doing there will have some bearing on where the Islamic State goes. Details of the actual raid we know is that Donald Trump was watching it. He says very good quality, so he must have been had some HD TV in front of him or something like that, suggesting that a lot of these soldiers or dogs maybe have some kind of cameras on them. Again, 12 helicopters, they arrive. He says they blow a hole in the side of the compound. A few details that we kind of know are that no Americans were injured, so not, sure how they then enter this compound in a way that nobody gets injured or killed. We know that dogs were involved, and that there were some adults who surrendered, 11 children surrendered, some adults were killed, and it seems like he means males, and then 2 of Baghdadi's wives died and were wearing suicide vests. I'm not sure if they were in any way killed by the Americans. Trump says that it was known that this compound that Baghdadi was in had tunnels underneath, but then none of the tunnels had, any escape routes or anything like that. So essentially they felt like it, if they went in this area, he was contained and couldn't get out. Baghdadi, I guess, flees down one of these tunnels and ends up detonating at the end of it with 3 of his children with him. I guess the U.S. then moves in, takes a sample. At the time, it seemed to me that Donald Trump kind of said that they didn't take his body, and I'm sure if he did detonate a suicide vest, that body would have been probably horribly maimed and kind of gross to take along with you, but maybe they cut off a finger. I don't know how the hell they confirmed this DNA or anything like that. And then all Americans were able to leave, I guess, safely. So those are, as far as I could tell at this point, the details of the raid in a way that they're being reported and seem to make sense. I want to talk about, now kind of what we're looking at for the Islamic State post Baghdadi. And I think anybody who's saying, oh, it's going to go this way or that way, I really don't know. I think it'll, I guess, depend on a lot of factors. There's some people who probably understand what the structure of ISIS is, how, top down it was. When I think bin Laden was killed, he was relatively unimportant to the, kind of operations of Al-Qaeda. And so, it probably didn't have a whole big effect on the operation. Now, was, Baghdadi calling the shots and ordering around thousands of Islamic State jihadists in Niger, Libya, Afghanistan, the Philippines, Sri Lanka? I don't know. It's, at least from everything that I've read, it's kind of hard to say. We also have found out that another important person within ISIS, a spokesperson who has been labeled high ranking, was killed in a operation that the Syrian Kurds are saying that they were jointly involved with. And so, maybe they took out, if they, end up taking out legitimately number 1 and 2 in the leadership structure, and it's a very top-heavy leadership structure, then maybe that could deal a real blow to the Islamic State. Whereas if these are, somewhat symbolic figures, and I'm not suggesting that it's not a good thing that Baghdadi's dead, because he's a horrid person. The world is a better place without him in it. But maybe he wasn't doing a whole lot day to day for the actual operations of the Islamic State, or overall. Maybe it wasn't a good brand. Certainly, you look at different, kind of countries or organizations throughout time, and sometimes if you have an ineffectual leader, that leader being removed or dying or whatever could create an opportunity for someone either, more dangerous or, a better, just a more effective leader. I don't know how to say that, not that that's a good thing, but that, that's certainly a possibility of this, that somebody more effective or more dangerous will come along and then head up this group of, thousands of radicalized nut jobs willing to blow themselves up for, what they see as some religious, cause and reason. And of course, they have the, big American boogeyman there to kind of justify their actions and, to, really, I'm sure make them so much more emotional and traumatized that they're willing to buy into this in the first place. Overall, it seems like the general trend of the Islamic State has been to become more of an insurgency and less of a, actual state somewhere, as that has been crushed by Iran, Iraq, the Iraqi Kurds, the Syrian Kurds, the United States, Russia, Assad, Hezbollah, and, a whole host of other Western coalition countries. So, it seems like the Islamic State as a state is not going to reconstitute itself, no matter who comes to power. However, can it remain an effective insurgency group? There's also the issue that this is just a massive range of what the Islamic State has become, really thanks to the policies of, in this case, George Bush first, but really look at John Brennan, Hillary Clinton, and Barack Obama, Samantha Power, throw them on the list, and what they've done in taking the side of, first the Libyan Islamic Fighting Group, so veterans and, similar, colleagues of al-Baghdadi who went to fight in Libya to overthrow Gaddafi, where, you then had a failed state, which continues to be in an ongoing civil war, creating vacuums for the Islamic State. But not only that, spreading these jihadist types far past Libya and into Mali, Niger, Burkina Faso, where, again, you have massive slaughters in these countries by suspected jihadist groups. And a lot of this was fueled by those policies in Libya. But then to make it even worse, they took that revolution and exported it to Syria and then armed up the same type of problematic, quote unquote, moderate rebels who, end up to be, a very much jihadist types or jihadist affiliates or taken advantage of by the jihadists. And then you've also had the rise of the Islamic State in Southeast Asia. The Sri Lanka shootings taken claim by the Islamic State. And of course, in the Philippines, you had a group claiming, to be an affiliate of the Islamic State, taking hold and controlling the city for 3 months. And not to mention the Islamic State Khorasan province in Nangarhar, Afghanistan, which, is now a real thorn in the side of the Afghan government and the United States there. All right, a few things on Trump's speech that I really haven't gotten into yet. The first one is what's gained a lot of media attention, and that is how Donald Trump portrayed the death of al-Baghdadi. I didn't talk about this in the narrative because honestly, I don't know if it's true. It's just the reporting of Donald Trump, and I could see Donald Trump saying this for a lot of reasons, but he says that Baghdadi died a coward, and he was, whimpering and whining and moaning and groaning and complaining all the way up until the time that he killed himself. So, some of the reaction is, oh, this is the president, this is too vulgar, and it doesn't meet the same decorum as Obama gave when he killed bin Laden. But to an extent, I actually think this is probably pretty good, and as far as something that a president could do, not a bad action to really make it look like that this guy was a coward, to, make sure you don't inspire or rally anybody to his cause. I guess another thing, that could come about killing Baghdadi is he turned him into a martyr. But if he died a coward, and after all the horrible things that, he's done, he goes and hides in the corner and blows himself up with his kids, after running away from the Americans. That would be, I think maybe something that would be a blow to, the steam or the, people who may be trying to teetering on verging the Islamic State or something like that. So I was fine with that part. And to be honest, what we're talking about here is, just disgusting and the worst things that human beings do. We're talking about, the United States waging a war that's first in Iraq, kills 1 million people and tortures and treats a whole bunch of people inhumanely, radicalizing a whole bunch of them. And then, this Syrian civil war that's killed 500,000 people and included one of the most ruthless, groups that has existed in a long time, the Islamic State, who, was dumping people in acid and beheading people on video and burning people alive, taking set slaves, just horrible, horrible things. And so, if that's gonna offend your sensibilities when you're talking about the ISIS leader, then, grow up a little bit. I didn't have any problem with that. I think at times, he's way too, patting himself on the back and taking too much credit for this. Overall, there were plenty of people in the region that hated the Islamic State enough to kill him. And I'm sure had Donald Trump passed the intelligence on to Assad, Rouhani, Putin, Nasrallah, any of these groups, and even some that the United States, like Iran or Hezbollah, would see as enemies, would be more than happy to have killed this guy. In his speech, he talked quite a bit about, what's happening with the overall Syria policy. He said that this was unrelated to the withdrawal of U.S. forces, so that was interesting. But does say the United States is going to stay in Syria for the oil. What a horrible policy. If he actually thinks that the Americans are going to sit on the Syrian oil and be able to produce it at any sort of profitable rate, seems entirely impossible and unrealistic. There's been a lot of good writing done on this, but first of all, this is Assad's oil, so I think internationally it would be hard for the company, like he suggested, Exxon, to be able to come in and actually, build infrastructure and start producing and selling the oil. The fact that, these oil fields are some of Syria's most productive, it does seem like it's the oil fields now around Deir ez-Zor. And so, my sense is that, Assad and Russia are really going to push for them. I think Russian contracts and Iranian contracts are kind of saying that they're the people that should get these oil fields. So I have a sense, and I'm not saying this because I'm some kind of guy who's always trying to find the way that, Trump's actually not doing the thing and that's as dumb as you think he's doing. But this could be like some kind of art of the deal thing where he thinks he's going to sell these oil fields back to Assad. I don't know if it'll play out well for him in the long run. I'm not sure that, he's really competent enough to negotiate this all the way. And of course has like a structure around him possible to do that. But my guess is I kind of have a suspicion that that's the tactic that he's thinking here. Trump acknowledged in his speech that Iran and Assad hate the Islamic State. So I think that's just important to point out. And that actually might be all I have about this. Trump did say a lot of other stuff in his speech that he wants to focus on and everything. But as far as it goes, I think it was somewhat a lot of Trump just spewing words. And so, again, I want to talk about every last detail he put out because I don't know how many of them are true. But I want to give you guys, the most coherent narrative that I could find on the actual killing, what I think might happen with the Islamic State, and talk about some of the other big moments from Trump's speech. Another, and just kind of a last quick little note here, is the Trump derangement syndrome thing, I think is an actual medical condition now because the Washington Post had a headline and called Baghdadi an austere religious figure, which was just outright shocking to me, that they would portray Baghdadi in any kind of way that wasn't, this guy is a horrible monster with, just unbelievably cruel war crimes and for the sake of being unbelievably cruel. So, that portrayal was very disturbing to me. And I think is going to be the kind of thing that will get Donald Trump reelected. That if he's running around killing these people and the Washington Post and what he calls the fake media is out there trying to maybe, not make their legacy look so bad, he's going to look a lot smarter than they do.